food production, and all farmers, families, First Nations, finally.
I thought you were going to say in show.
The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the so-called Workers' Party, the NDP, made it official that they've turned their back on Canadian workers. The NDP Liberal government is spending $40 billion on vehicle battery plants that amount to a subsidy of $5 million per employee. Ka-ching! Newsbreak, up to half the workers are coming from offshore, so taxpayers will be subsidizing foreign replacement workers. The battery building strategy has always been a boondoggle to transfer Canadian taxpayer dollars to the shareholders of foreign multinationals. It's an economic race to the bottom that this government wants to win. On Friday, I asked the Minister of Check Signing to release the contracts. He told this House that he negotiated this fiasco, but he said the opposite when asked the same question at committee. This evasion and doublespeak is the opposite of transparency. After 8 years, it is obvious that this government is not worth the cost. While common sense Conservatives are demanding that the contracts be released, the NDP are now on board to help the Liberals cover this up.
Well done.
The Honourable Member for Châteauguay-l'École. Mr. Speaker, we are sadly witnessing an upsurge in misogynistic comments here in Canada. A recent report by Léa Carrier in La Presse Plus highlighted this phenomenon among Canadian teenagers, and it's very worrying. We are fighting to counter this phenomenon and to ensure that women of all ages continue to live in an open, inclusive, and egalitarian society. In the Liberal Party, women have their place and make their voices heard. The Liberal Party holds the record for the number of women MPs and has a cabinet with equal numbers of men and women. We can see the difference in the measures and laws that are tabled and adopted. On the other side of the House, the Conservatives has the weakest women representation, with only 18% of female MPs. In Canada, we are out of the Stone Age, and we don't want to go back to the Stone Age. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Esquimalt, Saanich-Sooke.
Hate and violence against 2S LGBTQI plus Canadians, and especially against trans and gender diverse people, is clearly on the rise, including a recent spate of hate crimes in my own constituency. What we need now is action from the federal government to help communities build the resilience they need to fight back. Yes. In an e-petition, more than 5,000 Canadians have already called on the government to implement the recommendations from the White Paper on the status of trans and gender diverse people. As well, unions are calling for amending the Employment Equity Act to include 2S LGBTQI plus Canadians for the first time. This would help trans and gender diverse Canadians who are among the most economically marginalized get access to employment in the public service and federally regulated industries. Yes, we need leaders at all levels to speak out against hate and violence. But even more, we need to empower 2S LGBTQI organizations so that we can all take our place as full and equal citizens.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, for the 5th time in history, Distillery Beamer in Roberval in my riding has distinguished itself in an international competition. Its gin got a gold medal, and they were deemed Gin Masters in 2023 in the London Dry Gin category. It is made by local products. It has a unique taste. This gin is named after Horace Beamer, who built the 135 last miles of railway line between Roberval and the city of Quebec. Philippe and Alain, since 2017, have made of this microbrewery an absolute success. I would also like, Mr. Speaker, to commend my friend who associated with this microbrewery. To Beamer, congratulations, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Mission, Masque, Fraser Canyon.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party understands a home is the center of everything you do in your life. A home is the place you're secure. A home is where you raise your family. And everyone but this Liberal NDP coalition understands that this dream is being ripped from hundreds of thousands of Canadians.
Exactly.
When the government stands in the way of you getting a home, it stands in the way of your entire life going forward. That is why Conservatives have a plan to build more homes. We will, 1, require big cities to complete 15% more home building per year as a condition of getting federal infrastructure money. 2, we're going to give building bonuses to cities that exceed that target. 3, we're going to require every federally funded transit station be permitted for high-density apartments around it. And 4, we're going to sell off 15% of federal buildings and thousands of acres of surplus federal land suitable for new homes. Housing costs were not like this before the Liberals were elected. Housing costs won't be like this after they're defeated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Alfred Belin. Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to building a green Canada. Security, prosperity and health go hand in hand with a safe environment. Every Canadian deserves clean air, clean water and protection from extreme weather events. This is our golden opportunity to develop a thriving, sustainable, clean economy for ourselves, our children and grandchildren. The leader of the opposition and his party are still stuck in a Harper-era mentality where exports of carbon fuels are considered as the way to prosperity rather than a potential albatross in a world that is decarbonizing very rapidly. Let's put this rhetoric aside. We must not regress and allow industrial polluters risk the future and the security of our children. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions. Question oral. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Housing hell. How are we going to get out of it? That will be the title of my Common Sense documentary. In fact, it is, and more than 4 million people have watched it on the X platform. It shows that the cost of housing has doubled. Canada has one of the worst markets in the world, with much more expensive homes than in the US. People are living in tents. Will the Prime Minister become the 40 million and first person to watch the documentary to understand how to put an end to this housing hell and help people find housing? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. The Conservative leader is asking the government to withdraw from the housing sector. But we will not repeat the mistakes that he made when he was housing minister under the Harper government. The Conservative plan would not enable enough houses to be built quickly, and it would create more useless red tape. The plan would also stop funding housing projects and would further tax affordable housing. The Conservative leader is focusing on his online popularity, but meanwhile, we will be making sure that everyone has a roof over their heads.
But, Mr. Speaker, people do not have roofs over their head. After 8 years of this Prime Minister, housing costs have doubled. Toronto's the worst housing bubble in the world, and Canada has the worst mortgage bubble in the entire OECD after 8 years of his policies. That's why nearly 4 million people on X alone have watched my groundbreaking and much acclaimed documentary, Housing Hell, How We Got Here and How We Will Get Out. Will the Prime Minister become the 4 millionth Canadian to watch this documentary so he can see a common sense plan to reverse the housing hell that he's caused?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Canadians need our bold action to keep moving forward on the problem of housing affordability. Unlike the Conservative leader, we know that the federal government plays an essential role in leadership in housing. On this side, we're making historic investments in housing, we're linking public transit dollars to housing density, and we're working with cities to modernize and accelerate the way we build homes. While the Conservative leader focuses on clickbaits and views, we're focused on building homes for Canadians.
The Honourable Leader of the official opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's funny. He released a video the very same day of him in a starter home pretending that he was a real estate agent. But in reality, everyone laughed because they know that he's doubled the housing cost.
Right.
He's delivered an economy where we have the fewest homes per capita of any country in the G7, even though we have the most land to build on. And Toronto is now the worst housing bubble in the world after 8 years of this Prime Minister. So that's why I'm putting partisanship aside and offering the Prime Minister and the Liberal caucus a private screening of my documentary. Will the Prime Minister put his ego aside and join with me personally to take in this documentary, Housing Hell, How We Got In and How We'll Get Out of It?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
The reality, Mr. Speaker, is the Conservative leader continues to call for the federal government to get out of the business of housing. Right. And we will not repeat the same mistakes he made when he was housing minister under Stephen Harper. Right. The Conservative leader's present plan won't build enough homes fast enough, doesn't reach enough cities, and creates unnecessary red tape. He'd also defund affordable housing projects and tax affordable rental construction even more. While the Conservative leader focuses on clickbait and views, we're going to focus on building Canadians more homes.
That's right.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Speaker, he did try to make a video. It was a total failure. His videos don't get clicks and his houses don't have bricks. After 8 years, that's why housing costs have doubled. He shouldn't have to read his entire answer. I'm offering to inform him. If he would just take 15 minutes away from his photo ops, he can watch my brilliant documentary on X or YouTube with a common sense plan to require cities permit 15% more homes, give them bonuses if they exceed the target, require transit around every new federally funded, require housing around every federally funded transit station, and sell off 6,000 buildings. This is common sense. Let's bring it home.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader's plan is to pick fights with municipalities, to create more red tape, and to withdraw funding for affordable housing and affordable apartments. That's not a plan to build more housing, but he has demonstrated that he's extremely satisfied with his ability to spread misinformation and disinformation online, which, yes, I will admit, he's very good at. On this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we're focused on delivering solutions for Canadians. We're focused on building more housing for Canadians, not focused on self-aggrandizement like the Leader of the Opposition.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, he is the king of self-aggrandizement, as evidenced by the fact that he's backing my much-acclaimed documentary when he claims he hasn't even watched it. How would he know about the common sense solutions if he hasn't had the attention span to sit there for 15 minutes on YouTube or X and watch it, Mr. Speaker? We'll even try to get it on TikTok so that he can find it. Mr. Speaker, it includes a common sense plan to cut bureaucracy and taxes so that we can bring it home.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, when I came into question period today, I didn't think it'd be I'd be hearing an infomercial for how great Pierre Poilievre have social media skills. Sorry, the leader.
We'll back up. I mean, the Honourable Prime Minister knows he's not supposed to use the names of members of Parliament. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I apologize. I didn't think Canadians were going to be hearing an infomercial for the Leader of the Opposition's YouTube page. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is Canadians deserve a government focused on delivering housing for them. That is exactly what we are doing with historic deals with cities right across the country, with measures to build more housing quickly. We are concretely solving that while he's talking to himself online.
The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, as we continue to listen to this review of amateur film, well, meanwhile, the media is in crisis. Our journalism is getting weaker. Arts and culture, too. Our rural regions, French, they're all under pressure. Will the Prime Minister recognize that there is no worse time to cut 800 positions at Radio-Canada CBC. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we've been very concerned for years about what's happening in our media, arts and culture. That's why our government has taken concrete measures to support media throughout the country, to invest in local journalism, to defend journalists and their essential work to our democracy, to defend them from, for example, the web giants. We are very pleased to say that we have an agreement with Google under C-18. We will keep being there to support journalists throughout the country, especially local journalists who play a key role in our democracy. The honourable member will very clearly, Mr. Speaker, that is just not enough. The government is getting $100 million from Google. We'd really like to see that agreement, actually, but that is good news. Private media, however, had already cut more than $100 million in their operations. Not only does the Radio-Canada CBC want to get money out of that fund, but it also wants to cut French language and regional local services. And it also wants to give itself bonuses. Will the Prime Minister recognize that CBC needs to be held accountable to the government? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we will always support CBC, Radio-Canada and its services to local communities throughout the country. One of the first measures we took as a government was to cancel the Harper government's cuts to our public broadcaster. We supported local journalism and media, and that's very important during this difficult time. That's why we brought in Bill C-18. At a time when, unfortunately, the leader of the opposition is not doing anything about this issue, we will continue to support local media and journalists in Canada.
East.
These out-of-touch Liberals have let the housing crisis get so bad that in Halifax this winter, a man died alone in a tent. The average rent in Halifax is now over $2,000 a month. Leaving it up to big developers won't bring down rents. People are being rental evicted. We need real action, not just words. The Liberals are running around announcing and re-announcing existing funding that will not deliver homes for another 4 to 7 years. Will the Prime Minister take immediate action to secure existing empty buildings to get people off the streets this winter?
Hear, hear. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are continuing to reach out and work with communities, with municipalities and with provinces right across the country to deliver. We've been announcing projects completed that we started years ago. We're announcing projects that are starting today that will be completed in the coming years. We understand the efforts involved in solving this housing crisis. It requires us all to roll up our sleeves, which is why we put forward $4 billion in a housing accelerator to make sure that municipalities could build more homes. We're putting forward $15 billion to accelerate the construction of rental units. We're going to continue to be there for low-income and homeless people as well.
The honourable member for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford.
Mr. Speaker, food prices aren't going down. A record number of Canadians are turning to food banks for their meals. Before the doors open at Bridges to Hope Food Bank in St. John's, there's already a lineup waiting to collect food hampers. Meanwhile, big grocers like Sobeys, who was here yesterday, are seeing heaps of excess profit, all while offering a nickel to its employees. The Liberals are failing to lower food prices. When are they going to crack down on the corporate greed that is driving Canadians to food banks?
Hear, hear. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, more competition means lower prices, more choice, and more innovative products and services for Canadians. Our affordability legislation will empower the Competition Bureau to hold grocers accountable and prioritize consumers' interests. The Fall Economic Statement proposes further amendments to the Competition Act to crack down on predatory pricing, to better respond to anti-competitive mergers, and more. We are ensuring that Canadians have more competitive options, and we're limiting excess profits by corporations at the expense of Canadians.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Mr. Speaker, we just heard shocking testimony at the Human Resources Committee from the CEO of the Central Okanagan Food Bank. He says projections are another 100% increase in food bank demand in the next 3 to 4 months due to inflation. He expressed how donors and volunteers are now clients. Liberal inflationary spending and carbon tax are adding to the cost of food. After 8 years, this NDP Liberal government is just not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister take the tax off of farmers, families, and First Nations? Finally.
The Honourable Minister of Families.
Mr. Speaker, we will continue to invest in strengthening social security programs like Old Age Security, Canada Pension Plan, and support for families like the Canada Child Benefit and $10 a day national childcare. Programs which the Conservatives continue to vote against, totally lacking empathy and understanding for the struggle that Canadian families are facing. On this side of the House, we'll continue to do the hard work to ensure that we're there to support Canadian families.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that answer won't satisfy all the Canadians lining up in a food bank for the first time in their lives, or the food banks that are losing donors and volunteers due to Liberal inflation. We heard from not-for-profits how they see the rising price of gas as a barrier to volunteering, and how senior volunteers are being forced back to work to afford basic necessities due to inflation. After 8 years, this NDP Liberal government is just not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister take the carbon tax off of farmers, families, and First Nations? Finally.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's important that we focus on affordability for families, and it's also important that we look at facts when it comes to the carbon price that we've put in place. It's also important to remind Conservative members that they ran on a carbon price, and carbon pricing is the most efficient and the cheapest way to lower our emissions, Mr. Speaker. But with respect to food prices, particularly those facing lower income families, Mr. Speaker, today an article lists here that 94% of households with incomes below $50,000 receive far more rebates, exceeding their carbon tax costs in 2023. Mr. Speaker, lower income folks are enjoying more rebates than carbon costs because our carbon pricing.
The honourable member for Haldeman Norfolk.
After 8 years, this NDP Liberal government has made life unaffordable for Canadians in every province and territory. Canadians are suffering under this Prime Minister's oppressive carbon tax. And while he taxes, he also divides, pausing the carbon tax on home heating oil in Atlantic Canada because he wanted votes, while he quadruples the tax on every other Canadian. When will this Prime Minister finally cancel the carbon tax on families, farmers, and First Nations?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, I'll focus my response on an economist's response to the rhetoric in this House with respect to the carbon price. He said if we got rid of the carbon tax and the rebate, then this would harm a much larger fraction of lower and middle income households than it would higher income households, Mr. Speaker. Very clearly, the economist from Calgary indicates that our carbon price sends more money back to 94% of families who earn less than $50,000, Mr. Speaker. It's an affordability measure and it fights climate change.
The honourable member for Haldeman Norfolk.
At a time when this country is working towards reconciliation, the Liberals have saddled First Nations community with a punishing carbon tax. First Nations are so burdened by this unfair tax that they have decided to take the government to court. Canadians everywhere know that this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. So, when will this Prime Minister finally remove the carbon tax from farmers, First Nations, and families?
Yeah, when?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, I'll note that our carbon pricing mechanism sends more money back to lower income families than it does. That includes both the fiscal amount and the economic impact. And something the Conservatives love not to focus on is the impact of climate change, Mr. Speaker. Climate change impacts the price of food more than any other factor, Mr. Speaker. And we're also helping farmers because farmers are the ones that know climate change is real because it impacts them first, and that's what's driving up the cost of food, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Louis Saint-Laurent.
The honourable member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this Liberal government, food banks can barely keep up. In my region, in Loretteville, there's the Accueil Saint-Ambroise organization, which helps 50 to 60 additional families per month. Meanwhile, what's happening here in Ottawa? This Liberal government wants to impose a new additional carbon tax, and the Bloc Québécois wants to radically increase the tax. When will the Liberal Bloc finally understand that it's time to give a break to these struggling families? The Honourable Minister of Families. Mr. Speaker, we know that many families are struggling to buy groceries. We are here to support Canadians through targeted social programs and income supplements like the Canada Child Benefit, as well as the grocery benefit. We are also offering more support to charitable organizations and food banks. We are continuing to work hard to fight food insecurity. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to very sincerely thank the Minister for her efforts to speak French. But the fact that she's speaking French doesn't actually help with the content of what she's saying. In fact, it shows very clearly that this government is not worth the cost. Let me come back to what's going on in my riding. Again, Accueil Saint-Ambroise last year prepared 176 Christmas baskets, and this year already 238. Meanwhile, the Liberals are inventing a new tax, and the Bloc wants to increase it radically. My question is simple. Why create a new tax when people are struggling? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, this was an important moment. My colleague congratulated my other colleague for speaking French. I guess that's a bit of an attitude change among the Conservatives, but we should go further. We should congratulate my colleague for rising and speaking French despite the tyranny of his colleagues who might not want him to speak French. We will always support his right to speak French in this House. The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Mr. Speaker, do you know how many times this government has met the fossil fuel lobby over the last 2 years? 2,000 times. 2,000 meetings with oil and gas companies over 2 years alone. That's 3 meetings a day, 7 days a week, no holidays. If each of those meetings lasted 20 minutes, Mr. Speaker, that would be the equivalent of watching every single Simpsons episode, 35 seasons, and then do the same thing twice more. So if we're asking ourselves why this government doesn't get more done, well, it's very simple. They're too busy meeting up with their oil and gas sector buddies. What are they really talking about? The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a slightly odd question. We meet with stakeholders in all parts of the economy. It's very important for the government to hold conversations to ensure that we are listening to all perspectives in order to be able to produce good public policy. The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Well, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals and the fossil fuel lobby is basically a beautiful love story. 2,000 times they've met up. I mean, at this point, they should just move in together, I think. I have a friendly piece of advice for my colleagues on the Liberal backbenches who feel that that cabinet doesn't listen to them enough. Resign and then become an oil lobbyist. Is that why the Environment Minister invited Suncor, Imperial Oil, Meg Energy, and Cenovus to COP28? Is it that he can't stand a single day without seeing the oil companies? The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources. Mr. Speaker, we have created a plan to fight climate change. It is the strongest and most detailed in the entire world. And that's something we're very proud of. We have a plan. We believe in fighting climate change. And we are taking appropriate action every day in order to help our children and grandchildren have a better future. The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Mr. Speaker, 2,000 meetings with the fossil fuel lobby over 2 years. That's why Canada hasn't yet announced its plan to cap the fossil fuel sector emissions, because the oil companies are still drafting the plan. And in fact, they don't have time because they spend their whole day meeting with liberals. Meanwhile, the Global Carbon Project has announced at COP that we are going to leave behind the 1.5 degree warming target within 7 years. So while the Liberals and oil companies continue with their love fests, the planet is burning. Could the Liberals cancel 1 or 2 meetings and take care of the planet? The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, we implemented regulations to reduce methane emissions by 75%, and we are the first nation in the entire world to have done that. That's something we must do to act against climate change, and that's something we're doing every day.
The Honourable Member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Mr. Speaker, I want to help the NDP Liberal government understand why, after 8 years, Canadians know that the Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Just look at the carbon tax alone. A recent report by APAS shows that Saskatchewan farmers will pay over $40 million in carbon tax just to get their grains to port. A rebate doesn't even come close to covering that cost for our farmers. The solution is simple. Axe the tax. Why won't they just get it done?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Meeting farmers right across the country, the first question they ask me is, why does the Conservative Party of Canada not have a plan for the environment? I tell them we have a plan for the environment. We will work with governments.
I mean, for gosh sakes, he's right here. I can't hear him. So, hold on. Are we ready? The Honourable Minister of Agriculture from the top.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The question that I get from farmers across the country is why the Conservative Party of Canada does not have a plan for the environment. I tell the farmers right across the country, we do have a plan for the environment. We will work with farmers right across the country, and for an example, in Saskatchewan, we announced $4 million with the Western Grain Research Foundation, just to make sure that the farmers stay on the cutting edge, that they're able to yield larger crops and make more profit. We have and will continue to work with farmers right across this country.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, Mr. Speaker, farmers know that they are the leaders when it comes to environmental stewardship. Now, just imagine, Mr. Speaker, that you are a young producer. You grew up on the family farm, and your goal is to take over after your parents retire. You start looking over the bills and the costs associated with farming, and one of the highest line items is the carbon tax imposed by this Prime Minister. Rather than hiring a helping hand or upgrading your machinery, you're paying an increasing carbon tax. So, why won't the Prime Minister let his senators pass Bill C-2, 3, 4 and axe the tax for on-farm fuels?
Good question. The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Mr. Speaker, I would agree with my honourable colleague. Yes, the farmers are on the front line of the environment. They know that winds of over 200 kilometers an hour, destroying burns, destroying crops, and floods right across the country, and fires right across the country. They want a government that will deal with the environment and make sure that we work with governments, with agricultural clusters to make sure they're able to meet the demands. We will work and continue to work with the agricultural sector, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Ballyfer's Lloydminster.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, 2 million Canadians are relying on food banks to feed their families. The Prime Minister's punishing carbon tax is directly fueling the affordability crisis in this country, and still the Prime Minister plans to quadruple it. The Prime Minister and his failed policies are simply not worth the cost. It's time to axe the carbon tax before it bankrupts all Canadians, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister finally take the carbon tax off for our farmers, our families, and our First Nations?
The Honourable Minister of Family, Children and Social Development.
Mr. Speaker, in addition to the support that I continue to share in this House that we do for families, we've also introduced programs to support organizations that are working with Canadians to help address food insecurity, including over 300 organizations, Mr. Speaker, through the Community Services Recovery Fund. We've also invested almost $150 million to strengthen food systems and improve food security, including over 100 community projects. While the Conservatives continue to impose these investments, Mr. Speaker, we'll continue to work on behalf of Canadians.
The honourable member for Huron-Bruce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister, the Ag Minister, and the Environment are simply not listening to farmers. A pork farmer with a pork farm just down the road where I grew up, his natural gas bill in February was $4,300 just for natural gas. His carbon tax, any farmer make a living when you got to pay that much carbon tax on the natural gas you use on your farm. When will the Prime Minister take the tax off farmers, families, and make it fair for farmers? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate my honourable colleague's concern, but the fact of the matter is farmers are concerned about the environment. Farmers are on the front lines. Farmers understand that you have to take care of the environment. When you have winds of over 200 kilometres an hour destroying all the infrastructure on a property, that adds no doubt to the farmer's cost. It adds to the price of food. It adds to everything. That's why it's so important that our government has an environmental plan to make sure that our agricultural sector will continue to thrive.
The honourable member for Rosemont La Petite Patrie. Mr. Speaker, not only is the Minister of the Environment going to COP28 with a record number of oil lobbyists, it seems to be a pathological habit. When it comes to the seat of power, the PM Finance's office, guess who the Liberals meet with and listen to the most? Bingo, the oil and gas companies. According to a TVA compilation, the Liberals open their doors 3 times more often to the fossil fuel industry than to environmentalists. 3 times more. If the Liberals are missing their greenhouse gas reduction targets, could it be because they're puppets of big polluters? The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources. Mr. Speaker, as I already said, we meet with participants from all industries. Obviously, that includes oil, but it also includes auto and many other industries. As I've already said, we announced something that is a first in the entire world. Yesterday, we announced that we are going to put in place regulations to reduce methane emissions by 75%. We're the first country in the world to have done that. That's leadership for you on climate change.
Victoria.
Canadians are experiencing the horrific impacts of the climate crisis, while Liberals delay, disappoint, and fail to protect our planet. Young people are not only worried about their future, they want to be part of the solution. Hundreds of them just delivered mock cover letters applying for a youth climate corps, and 2 out of 3 young people would consider enrolling in this program to respond to disasters, to create climate resilient infrastructure, and to reduce emissions. Today, I tabled a motion to create a youth climate corps like President Biden did. Will the Prime Minister listen to our future leaders and establish a youth climate corps?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd just like to take a moment to welcome my friend and colleague back to the House. It's good to have her back, not only because it's good to talk about how we fight climate change and not whether we fight climate change in this House. Mr. Speaker, I think the idea with respect to a youth environment corps to fight climate change and bring forward great ideas is an awesome one, and I'm looking forward to talking with the member. And it also gives me great pleasure to announce in this House that Canada is the first country ever to commit to an oil and gas methane emissions target reduction. 75%, Mr. Speaker. Other countries will follow in our footsteps, and we'll bring down our methane emissions by 75% by 2030. Thank you, Mr.
The Honourable Member for Laval-les-Îles. Mr. Speaker, we Quebecers and Canadians are proud of our culture, our French language, and our commitment to protecting the environment for future generations. In the face of conservative policies that would set us back to the Stone Age, could we know from the Quebec Lieutenant, the Minister of Transport, what initiatives the government is taking to safeguard and enhance our commitments to the environment, language, and culture? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to congratulate my colleague on his excellent work. Quebecers are proud to take part in the energy transition, and our government is proud to support it. The Conservatives think it's all a waste of time, but we will continue to support our language and our culture and build these things up, whereas the Conservatives would tear it all down. The Conservatives aren't even letting their colleagues work in French, but we are making French a priority for Quebecers. And the Conservatives would take us back to the Stone Age.
Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
After 8 years, workers know they cannot rely on the NDP. The NDP leader initially called for the release of EV contracts, but last night the NDP flip-flopped and voted with the Liberals to bury them. These contracts will cost taxpayers over $40 billion. That's about $3,000 per Canadian family, and the money will be used to fund foreign replacement workers instead of Canadian paychecks. The NDP Liberal government betrayed workers and are complicit in cover-up. So what did the Liberals offer the NDP to get them to change their position and abandon workers and taxpayers?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Investments like the LG Stellantis EV battery plant represent a win for the economy, a win for Canadian workers, and a win for the fight against climate change. But the Conservatives are so committed to their doomsday narrative that they just can't admit that anything good is happening. In a recent article in the Globe and Mail, a journalist writes about the Conservative leader. He has not said he opposes subsidizing these battery makers. Rather, he is seeking to rile up working-class voters by falsely suggesting foreigners might be stealing their jobs. While the Conservatives are blinded by their self-induced rage, we're focused on realizing a positive vision for the future of our economy.
Just say there's a lot of chatter in the chamber. Just hope we bring it down just a little bit. The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Mr. Speaker, I have a simple proposition for the member. If the NDP Liberal government is genuinely proud of their work, then release the contracts. Yeah. Let all of us see them so that we can know. But the NDP is complicit with the Liberals in trying to bury these contracts. Right. Why? Every Canadian family will pay $3,000 for these deals. So they want to know what is in these deals for them. Again, what did the Liberals offer the NDP to get them to change their position, abandon workers, and hide these contracts? What are they hiding?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to share positive news. Canada is number 3 in the world in foreign direct investment, which is something that we should all be proud of, Mr. Speaker. Brendan Sweeney from the Trillium Network for Advanced Manufacturers said, and I quote, about specialized expertise workers needed from outside of Canada to help set up the giant facility. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of Windsorites going off to the U.S. to help set up, test, and service machinery in plants. It's a little hypocritical to fail to take into account the way foreign direct investment works.
The honourable member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, and Rideau Lakes.
To help pay for overseas replacement workers, the NDP Liberal government is going to send every Canadian family a bill for $3,000. The formerly pro-worker NDP have refused to stand up to the Prime Minister and demand the release of contracts that detail the number of foreign replacement workers that are going to take Canadian jobs. This Prime Minister clearly isn't worth the cost to Canadian workers after 8 years, and neither are the NDP. So will the Prime Minister finally stand up and tell Canadians how many foreign replacement workers $40 billion buys?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, it's curious after 8 years in opposition to listen from these Conservatives and how little they have learned on foreign direct investment, Mr. Speaker. Clearly nothing. How little they understand about free trade deals, Mr. Speaker. Clearly nothing. How little they understand about creating good middle-class jobs, Mr. Speaker. What they are clearly against is 2,500 full-time jobs at the Stellantis plant, 2,300 construction jobs there. Mr. Speaker, it's clear that under a Conservative administration, Canada would be closed for business. Guess what, Mr. Speaker? Not on our watch.
The honourable member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, and Rideau Lakes.
Well, let's talk about what's happened under their watch. The Canadian Building Trade Union says that so far, this NDP Liberal government has cost them $300 million in wages. So if they are so proud of their record and so proud of these great deals that are going to cost every Canadian family $3,000, why won't they just release the contracts? They know that releasing those contracts will expose that $40 billion is buying a lot of foreign replacement workers that should instead be funding Canadian paychecks. Why won't they release the contracts today?
The Honourable Minister of Employment.
Mr. Speaker, there are smart people on the Conservative benches, including trade lawyers and people who understand that contracts between nations and between countries need to stay confidential because of important trade secrets. Mr. Speaker, what do the Conservatives have against the fact that Canada is now third in the world in foreign direct investment, Mr. Speaker, after the United States, after Brazil? Who is it? Canada, ahead of China, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, they're against Dow in Fort Saskatchewan. They're against Stellantis. They're against Bécancour. When are the Conservatives going to be on the side of workers, Mr. Speaker? I don't know. Maybe they do.
I don't know why the chatter went up. Je comprends pas, là. L'honorable député de...
The honourable member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, not even 2 weeks after the government's economic update, CBC Radio-Canada, a Crown corporation and the public broadcaster, paid for mainly with our tax dollars, is cutting 800 positions and firing 600 people. The media crisis that affected the private sector is clearly spreading to the public sector. This will affect the quality of information, news, TV series, soaps, and our ability to tell stories. How long has the minister known about this? Did she agree with the decision? And if she didn't, what's she going to do to try to prevent the bloodletting? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I share my colleagues' concerns about the future of CBC Radio-Canada and about the future of the media in general. And that's why our government is working. We modernized the legislation to better support broadcasting all across the country. And obviously, when it comes to CBC Radio-Canada, in our 2015 budget, we restored funding that the Conservatives had cut. We also supported them through the pandemic. We will continue to be there to defend the future of CBC. The Honourable Member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, Radio-Canada does better than CBC with its news and other programming. Everything works better at Radio-Canada than at CBC. And why is that? We know that there are fewer employees at Radio-Canada, but they're suffering just as many cuts as CBC. We can't imagine that the Heritage Minister was unaware that this was coming. Did she inform the finance minister before the update, the Honourable Minister of Heritage? Mr. Speaker, we are obviously concerned about the future of CBC Radio-Canada, and that's why we supported them adequately during the pandemic. And when we took office after the Conservatives, we restored a great deal of funding that they had cut. We respect this Crown Corporation. We respect their independence. We would encourage management to be more transparent about this type of decision, but we will work to ensure the long-term survival of this organization.
Elgin, Middlesex, London.
Mr. Speaker, in little under a decade, Canada's housing costs have basically doubled. Earlier today, members of the Canadian Alliance of Student Associations shared with me a story of 7 individuals living in one apartment. We know that there are many similar stories about this across this country. After 8 years, students are becoming homeless under this NDP Liberal government. This PM is not worth the cost. When will this government step aside so we can get Canada back on track?
The Honourable Minister of Housing.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable colleague for her question, and I thank the members of the Canadian Alliance of Student Associations for their advocacy. In fact, I used to be a member when I was in student government at St. FX University. Mr. Speaker, I should say, when we actually compare the policies of the Conservative Party to the policies that the government is putting forward, it is clear that their policies will do more harm than good and raise the cost of living. We are putting policies in place that's going to remove the tax on new apartment construction so we get more apartments built. They are going to put the tax back on. Mr. Speaker, we're investing in affordable housing when they're campaigning on a commitment to make sure they do not invest. When it comes to supporting students and the housing that they need, the solutions lay on our side of the House.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, last Saturday, our leader unveiled a documentary on the housing crisis to explain to Canadians its causes and some proposed solutions. There have been over 4 million views, and for good reason. After 8 years of this Liberal government, housing prices have doubled, rents, mortgages, and homelessness is going through the roof. People are suffering. Will the minister check his ego at the door, watch the Leader of the Opposition's documentary, and adopt the suggested solutions to help Canadians afford housing? The Honourable Minister.
Accept a question talking about checking your ego at the door regarding the opposition leader who uses his space on the floor of the House of Commons to invite people to watch a video. I'm curious how many of those views are actually the opposition leader.
The Honourable Minister of Housing.
Mr. Speaker, I'm beginning to question how many of those views are the opposition leader actually going home at night and watching himself on the internet. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to which party has a plan to build more homes, it is clear that it is the government. We have a plan to cut the cost of building. We have a plan to invest in cities. We have a plan to invest in affordable housing. We will get the job done.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, the minister may laugh, but what's he going to say to the young man in Sherbrooke who can't afford $1,500 a month for rent, so he's living in a tent it's like a refugee camp right in the middle of Sherbrooke. And that's because of all the things the Liberals have done in the past 8 years. None of them are working. And even with every effort that ordinary people are making, they can't even afford to pay their rent. What's the government going to do about this? Mr. Speaker, I understand this situation. And as a matter of fact, that's why we've invested in affordable housing in Sherbrooke. That's why we're investing like $900 billion with our partners in the province of Quebec. It's important to continue making those investments. It's incredible, Mr. Speaker, that this member and the Leader of the Opposition opposed investments in affordable housing. It's essential to keep investing.
To build the homes that Canadians need, including in Sherbrooke.
The Honourable Member for Pontiac. Mr. Speaker, our businesses here in Canada have been attracting amazing amounts of foreign investment. And in Quebec, we know that 99% of businesses are small and medium-sized businesses. They play a key role in our economic growth. We must avoid retreating into an economic stone age that would favor foreign, polluting multinationals. So I have a question for the Minister of Economic Development for Quebec. How are we supporting entrepreneurs in Quebec? The Honourable Minister of Economic Development. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague's right. Our government partners with small business, not just in Quebec, but all around the country. Unlike the Conservatives who'd like to invest more in fossil fuels, we're investing in green energy, like a company in Montreal and in Thetford Mine, in the Gaspé. We're supporting wind power. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue investing in the economy of the future. I'd like to know, what are the Conservatives going to cut back on for entrepreneurs in Quebec?
Grand Lake. Mr. Speaker, under this Prime Minister, New Brunswickers are struggling to pay the rent. After 8 years, he's just not worth the cost. While rents are too high in major cities, recent increases have been the biggest in New Brunswick. According to Stats Canada, rent has inflated nearly 30% just in New Brunswick in the last 4 years alone. Will the Prime Minister agree that now is the time to get the gatekeepers out of the way so more rental housing can be built in the province of New Brunswick?
The Honourable Minister of Housing and Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my colleague for his question. When it comes to actually getting gatekeepers out of the way and reducing red tape, I point the honourable member that we recently signed an agreement with the City of Moncton so they can change the way they allowed cities to be built in that city. We are going to see thousands of new homes in the city, and now we are working with other cities across New Brunswick and rural communities as well. What's fascinating, Mr. Speaker, if the Conservatives were concerned about reducing the cost of rent, they should abandon their plans to put the GST back on rental construction. They should avoid the mistakes of the past by abandoning their commitment to stop investing in affordable housing. We will get...
The Honourable Member for Kamloops Thompson Caribou.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this Liberal NDP government's incompetence and lack of caring, we have seen a housing hell unleashed on Canadians. They've actively caused housing, mortgages, and housing-related costs to double in the last 8 years. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost. We have people living in tent cities and in their cars, Mr. Speaker, and this is when the dream of home ownership is evaporating for younger Canadians. They are putting photo ops ahead of housing. When will this Prime Minister realize that he's built more tent cities than houses?
The Honourable Minister of Housing.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the enormously difficult situation that families are going through who are having trouble affording the cost of a place to live. But I will not accept criticisms from that member or the Conservative Party of Canada when they stand up to, when the cameras are on, to make hay for a political reason, when they had the opportunity to stand up to vote on whether we should support initiatives that are going to help the homeless population in Canada, they vote against them. They are currently campaigning on a promise to get out of the business of housing. We've made that mistake for 30 years. We started this government in 2017 with the National Housing Strategy to invest in affordable housing. We need to invest, not make cuts, as that member wants to.
The Honourable Member for Bellechasse, Les Etchemins, Lévis. Mr. Speaker, after 8 years, this Prime Minister has created housing hell. Mortgage payments have more than doubled, and housing prices have also doubled. Makeshift encampments where people sleep in tents are popping up all over Canada. In Sherbrooke, for example, a young man in his 30s has no choice but to live in his tent because he can't find a room anywhere. Will this Prime Minister put an end to his inflationary spending so Quebecers can have a roof over their heads this winter, Mr. Speaker? The Honourable Minister of Housing. Mr. Speaker, it's very important to have a solution to the problem. Currently, we are investing in the construction of affordable housing in Sherbrooke. We're investing in partnership with the province of Quebec to build 8,000 new affordable units. It's very important to continue this work. The opposition to these programs from the Conservatives is unfathomable. It's just impossible to keep answering these questions. The Honourable Member for Saint-Léonard, Saint-Michel. Mr. Speaker, several countries have agreed to triple their production capacity for renewable energies like solar, wind, and hydroelectric. This commitment contrasts sharply with the leader of the opposition's approach, who favors oil production and symbolizes a retreat to the Stone Age in the fight against climate change. Can the minister inform us of the commitment made by our government at COP28 to advance Canada and its renewable energy production capacities? The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources. I'd like to thank my colleague for her hard work. This global goal is consistent with our work to provide affordable energy while protecting Quebec's advantage in reliable, clean energy. The new federal clean investment credits will unlock projects and create jobs. While we work hard to build up, on the other side, the Conservatives want to tear down Quebec's clean economy, and the Bloc has nothing to offer but talk.
The Honourable Member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Mr. Speaker, in British Columbia, 2 people died, and 1 is still missing at sea because their vessel could not be found. It was discovered that life-saving direction-finding technology has been unavailable. Those on the water deserve to know that help will be there to find them. But instead of investing in the safety of people, the Liberals followed the lead of the Conservatives, slashing funding and closing 10 Coast Guard communication centres. Canadians deserve better. When will the government provide the Coast Guard with the necessary resources to keep mariners safe?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to Minister of DFO and the Canadian Coast Guard.
Mr. Speaker, ensuring the health and safety of Canadians at sea is a top priority for our government. The Coast Guard is working around the clock to modernize and replace the radio detection system with a more robust and accurate network. While this work continues, Mr. Speaker, there are a wide variety of other systems in place, including a radar installation and shipboard detection finding system on Coast Guard vessels. But be reassured, Mr. Speaker, and I want Canadians to be reassured that the Coast Guard's mission of safety at sea is unimpeded by this work.
The Honourable Member for Courtenay Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, this summer Canada relied on volunteer firefighters and search and rescue to risk their lives to keep us safe, but the Liberals have been letting them down. 9,500 volunteer firefighters quit in 2023, and the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs, who are here today, say that doing the work and paying for the equipment is unaffordable. Well, the Liberals are in luck. The NDP has a bill that would up the volunteer firefighter tax credit to $10,000. So will the government support our volunteer firefighters by voting yes on the NDP's plan to increase the volunteer firefighter tax credit?
The Honourable Minister.
For the very important question. In fact, actually, just yesterday I was in West Kelowna visiting the firefighters after the devastating wildfires that took place in West Kelowna and all across British Columbia. We talked about many different measures that the firefighters were going to be supporting, in addition to training of 1,000 firefighters, and we have a lot of options currently on the table, but make no doubt about it, Mr. Speaker, we will be supporting our firefighters. Thank you.
Good. And that's all the time we have for question period today. I've got a recognition to do, and then we'll do some points of order afterward. Wish to draw the attention of the members, the presence in the gallery of the Honourable Richard Muston, Minister of Community Services and Minister responsible for the Workers' Safety Compensation Board of the Yukon. And she's not. All right. The Honourable Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Point of order on decorum. During member statement, the member from Chateauguay called the Women of the Conservative Party weak. Now, I've been called a lot of things in my life, but weak isn't one of them. The member's language tearing down women and reducing our value to a quota is exactly what discourages women from running for office and makes it harder for every single one of us here. Strength comes from courage of action, no matter someone's gender, not from tokenization. If the member wanted to show some strength of her own, she'd apologize.
I'll just say quickly that we must be judicious in our words. We will go back and listen to it and come back to the House if something needs to be done. I believe the the Honourable Government House Leader has something to table. There you go. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that. Pursuant to Standing Order 111.1, I have the honour to table in both official languages a certificate of nomination and biographical notes for the proposed appointment of Eric Jantz to the position of Clerk to the House of Commons. That the nomination and biographical notes be referred to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I don't know, maybe the next step should be to ask him if he really wants to be there. It being 3:16, the House now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division, the motion to concur in the 13th report on the Standing Committee on Veterans Affairs. Call in the members. Okay, just being sure before I start reading. Okay, the question is as follows. Monsieur Desilets, appuie.
Mr. Desilets, seconded by Ms. Chabot, moved that the 13th report of the Standing Committee on Veterans Affairs presented on Thursday, November 9th, 2023, be conferred in. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favour of the motion will please rise.
Mr. Bazan.
Schmale.
Pardon me. Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mr. Paulus.
Mr. Paulus.
Mr. Halan.
Mr. Halan.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Monsieur Berthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Aboutayev.
Mr. Aboutayev.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Lloyd.
Monsieur Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Melillo.
Mr. Melillo.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Ms. Gladue.
Ms. Gladue.
Mrs. Kramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Kramp-Nyman.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Vempopta.
Mr. Vempopta.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Morant.
Mr. Morant.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Mazer.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford-Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford-Lloydminster.
Monsieur Gould.
Monsieur Gould.
Mr. Currick.
Mr. Currick.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Dreesen.
Mr. Dreesen.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Leipert.
Weber.
Pardon me, Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Leipert.
Mr. Leipert.
Mr. Canna.
Mr. Canna.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Leslie.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Garon.
Monsieur Garon.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Posé.
Madame Posé.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Lemire.
Madame Chabot.
Madame Chabot.
Monsieur Trudel.
Monsieur Trudel.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Monsieur Blanchette-Jonca.
Monsieur Blanchette-Jonca.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
Monsieur Désilé.
Monsieur Désilé.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Ms. Kwan.
Ms. Kwan.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Ms. Idlout.
Ms. Idlout.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Backrack.
Ms. Barron.
Ms. Barron.
Ms. Zarillo.
Ms. Zarillo.
Ms. Collins Victoria.
Ms. Collins Victoria.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Ms. McPherson.
Ms. McPherson.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
Monsieur Lightbound.
Monsieur Lightbound.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Monsieur Rodriguez.
Ms. Gould.
Ms. Gould.
Ms. Gould.
Monsieur Rodriguez.
Monsieur Rodriguez.
Ms. Tassi.
Ms. Tassi.
Mr. Varani.
Mr. Varani.
Ms. Sachs.
Ms. Sachs.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Bennett.
Mr. McKay.
Mr. McKay.
Ms. Scrow.
Ms. Scrow.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Ms. Cara.
Ms. Cara.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Mrs. Valdez.
Mrs. Valdez.
Ms. Jazek.
Ms. Jazek.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Ms. Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Ms. Debrusin.
Ms. Debrusin.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Ms. Dillon.
Ms. Dillon.
Monsieur Elkoury.
Monsieur Elkoury.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Dogood.
Mr. Dogood.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Serré.
Monsieur Serré.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Briard.
Madame Brière.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Monsieur Iacano.
Monsieur Iacano.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Miss Cedar Brampton South.
Miss Cedar Brampton South.
Mr. Sobara.
Mr. Sobera.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Madame Latanzio.
Ms. Latanzio.
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Ms. Bradford.
Miss Bradford.
Madame Châtel.
Madame Châtel.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Ms. Taylor Roy.
Miss Taylor Roy.
Mr. Carr.
Mr. Carr.
Ms. Gainey.
Ms. Gainey.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
Just letting everybody know that the House of Commons goes live at 2 o'clock today, 2 p.m. Eastern. I will be shutting down the channel to get ready for live in a little while. This is a long pause on 0000. Are they done voting or what?
The electronic voting period has ended. If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function or stand in the chamber and the chair will recognize them. Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Speaker, I had trouble using the app. I would have voted yes.
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 167, 167. Nays contre 149, 149.
I declare the motion carried. I wish to inform the House that because of the deferred recorded divisions, government orders will be extended by 15 minutes. I am now ready to rule on the question of privilege raised on December 4th by the House Leader of the official opposition concerning the Speaker's participation by video message at Provincial Party Convention on December 2nd, 2023. Dans une déclaration faite plus tôt dans la séance, le président.
The Speaker, in a statement earlier in the sitting, had explained that he had been asked to record a personal message to be played as part of a tribute video to a colleague and friend from the National Capital Region, whom he has known for many decades. He apologized for the perception of partisanship that his involvement in the said convention created. He also indicated that if concerns were brought to the floor of the House, he would recuse himself from discussions on this matter. As such, I fulfilled the role bestowed upon the Deputy Speaker to weigh the arguments from honourable members, assess the procedural authorities and precedents, and prepare a ruling on this matter.
It is exceedingly rare that actions involving the Speaker are questioned in the chamber. It requires a thoughtful and serious response. The role of Speaker is central to our parliamentary institutions. It cannot be seen to be diminished or drawn into partisan debate. It is with this in mind that I approach this ruling. In his intervention, the House Leader of the official opposition alleged that the Speaker failed in his responsibility to uphold the impartiality of his office. He did so by providing a video tribute in an allegedly partisan manner from the Speaker's office and dressed in the Speaker's attire for the departing interim leader of a provincial party, which was shown at the party's convention. He contended that the Speaker clearly indicated a partisan preference. The member quoted extensively from numerous procedural authorities on the high expectation for impartiality that is attached to the position of Speaker of the House of Commons. The member argued that the matter should be viewed as a contempt of the House. He pointed to House of Commons Procedures and Practice, 3rd edition, which emphasizes that a matter of contempt can be addressed by the House, even in the absence of any specific breach of privilege. In a subsequent intervention, he called on the Speaker to resign. Le député de la Prairie, pour sa part, a insisté pour dire que la...
The member for La Prairie, for his part, emphasized that the Speaker's participation in a partisan political activity was a breach of his impartiality. He posited that speakers need two qualities to successfully fulfill their duties. They must always show impartiality in all their activities and must show good judgment. On both counts, according to the member, the Speaker has failed to do so, and as such must resign. The member for New Westminster Burnaby also spoke of the gravity of the situation. According to the member, the Speaker's actions went against the principle of impartiality, so important to the position. He called on the Deputy Speaker to find a prima facie question of privilege, and that the matter be referred to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs.
Other members also intervened on the matter, but I would like to highlight a quote from the House of Commons Procedure and Practice, 3rd edition, at page 323, that the House Leader of the official opposition cited. It bears repeating because it succinctly sums up the requirement for impartiality by the Speaker. It says, quote, "When in the chair, the Speaker embodies the power and authority of the office, strengthened by rule and precedent. He or she must at all times show and be seen to show the impartiality required to sustain the trust and goodwill of the House," unquote. Allegations of partisanship against the Speaker are a very serious matter. To protect the integrity of the position, it is generally not permissible for members to call into question the Speaker's impartiality. If members wish to object to the Speaker's conduct, there is a clear process by which this is to be accomplished. Comme on peut lire à la page 323 à la procédure.
As one can read on page 323 of House and Commons Procedure and Practice, quote, "The actions of the Speaker may not be criticized in debate or by any means except by way of a substantive motion," unquote.
The opposition acknowledged as much in its remarks, noting that this is the usual manner in which complaints against the Speaker are dealt with. While he would have this motion brought forward before the House by way of a prima facie finding a question of privilege, this is not the course of action that has been followed in the past. As it is further stated at pages 620 and 621 of the same work, quote, "Only by means of a substantive motion for which 48 hours written notice have been given may the actions of the chair be challenged, criticized, and debated," unquote. Il existe des exemples de situations.
We do have past examples of similar occurrences. On June 1st, 1956, at page 4540 of the debates, Speaker Baudouin directed that a motion be first placed on notice to address complaints about his conduct. Similarly, on March 13th, 2000, Speaker Parent took the same approach when faced with a comparable situation. In both cases, Speakers Baudouin and Parent declined to rule on their own conduct and did not ask another chair occupant to rule on their behalf. I will note that the matter at issue in each case was dissatisfaction with a procedural ruling. In the present case, what is at issue is the Speaker's conduct outside of the House, and whether or not it has brought into question his impartiality. As we saw, the Speaker decided to recuse himself and to entrust me in guiding the House as to the next steps to take, if any, regarding this matter.
Official opposition elected to bring his concerns through a question of privilege and not through the preferred means to which such a matter forward to the House, that is to place a substantive motion on notice. I allowed the arguments yesterday, even though it is not the usual course of action, as I recognize the grave concerns some members had and wished to express. La présidence se trouve dans une position difficile.
The chair finds itself in a difficult position, having to determine if, on the face of it, a colleague's behavior brings into question the impartiality of the chair. This is more properly an issue for the House to decide. I also acknowledge that for all of us, the House, chair occupants, and members, to settle this matter as soon as possible.
That basis alone. Rather than insisting that a substantive motion be placed on notice, I find that this matter should have priority over other orders of the day and will allow the House Leader of the official opposition to move his motion. In future, if members wish to take issue with the conduct of the Speaker, rather than raising points of order or questions of privilege, I would instead direct them to place a substantive motion on notice. I thank you all for your attention. The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the Speaker's public participation at an Ontario Liberal Party convention as Speaker of the House of Commons constitutes a breach of the tradition and expectation of impartiality required for that high office, constituting a serious error of judgment which undermines the trust required to discharge his duties and responsibilities, and therefore move that the House refers that matter to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs with instruction that it recommend an appropriate remedy.
I'll just wait for that copy to come up. Mr. Scheer, seconded by Mr. Bertal, moves that the Speaker's public participation at an Ontario Liberal Party convention as Speaker of the House of Commons constitutes a breach of the tradition and expectation of impartiality required for that high office, constituting a serious error of judgment which undermines the trust required to discharge his duties and responsibilities, and therefore the House refers the matter to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs with instruction that it recommend an appropriate remedy. Debate. The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the difficult position that this whole scandal has put you in, and I appreciate your ruling where you spelled out the normal course of actions for members to follow when dealing with a chair occupant or dealing with the Speaker. And I appreciate the fact that you also acknowledged the time-sensitive nature of what this scandal has caused for the House and for members. As you know, I made substantive remarks yesterday in making the case for this motion, for this privilege motion. And to save the House's time, I won't go through all of those again, but just to sum up the points. The Speaker has incredible authority here in the chamber. The Speaker makes decisions that are not subject to appeal. There's no higher authority that members can ask for a second opinion should they lose out on a point of order or a question of privilege. The Speaker's word is the command during debates. If the Speaker doesn't like something that was said, the Speaker can take away the floor from a member. The Speaker has the sole authority to expel a member from the chamber. And the Speaker is the only person that can name someone and force them to leave the chamber for the rest of the day. And that decision is not appealable either. In other parliaments, that type of thing must be ratified by the House. In our chamber, the Speaker has sole executive authority. And the reason why I'm talking so much about the incredible powers that the Speaker has is because for members to accept someone to hold that power, there has to be trust in that person. And Mr. Speaker, I'd like to just mention at this point in time that I'll be sharing my time with the honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. So that is the type of authority the Speaker has here in the chamber. Around the precinct, the Speaker also has incredible authority as well. He chairs the Board of Internal Economy. The Board of Internal Economy sets the rules about how members are able to use resources to fulfill their functions, everything from printing protocols and ensuring there's adequate translation services to what types of expenses are allowed. It's a very important role. And for members to accept someone to hold that authority, they must have 100% trust that the person who holds that position is exercising their duty free of any partisan bias, free of any favoritism or preferential treatment. And it can be challenging. You know, we all get elected through a political process. All of us seek a nomination. We join a political party. We sell memberships in that party in advance of a nomination race to win that nomination. During general elections, we go out and we pound in signs promoting our party, both in terms of the brand and in terms of the policies and in terms of the leader. And we all understand that. When somebody enters this place and decides to run for Speaker, usually somebody who chooses that option goes to some length to assure members that they do have a nonpartisan side, that they can put aside their partisanship, their partisan affiliations, take the Speaker's chair, put on the Speaker's robes, and be impartial. Now, in the case of the current Speaker was the former President of the Liberal Party. The current Speaker was the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister right up until he ran for Speaker. In the course of this Parliament, between the last election and the date that he was elected as Speaker, the current Speaker was engaged in very partisan activities. He was on, as the Prime Minister's Parliamentary Secretary, he was busy because there were a lot of scandals the Prime Minister was involved in. There's all kinds of ethics violations and spending scandals and allegations of corruptions across multiple departments. And the current Speaker would dutifully go to committee, defend the Prime Minister, engage in filibusters to prevent the committee from arriving at a decision, and go on TV with other members of other parties and make accusations and defend his boss in a very partisan way. So we were all asked as MPs to go on a bit of a leap of faith with this current Speaker, that after being elected, after winning a majority of the votes in the House, that he would go above and beyond what might be expected. Because his partisanship was so intense and so recent, we went out on a bit of a limb to believe that he would put aside all that partisanship and conduct himself in a way that would earn that trust and justify that trust. And we did give him the benefit of the doubt. And that's why it was so shocking. I could not believe my eyes when I saw the image of the Speaker in his robes, in his office, here on Parliament Hill, at a hyper-partisan political event. I mean, this was no quiet dinner amongst friends. This was a leadership election convention for the Ontario Liberal Party, a party that he doesn't even, in a province that he does not currently reside in, Mr. Speaker. So I was shocked. At first, I honestly thought it was a bit of a joke. I thought somebody was trying to troll me or something like that, and I didn't believe it at first. And then upon seeing the other images shared and seeing the video itself, I realized, oh my goodness, the Speaker has actually done this. And here's why it matters for Canadians. You know, we've heard the Speaker's excuse yesterday. We talked about the incredible authority, the need for the trust between the House members and the Speaker. And if we think of other institutions in Canada that we could all instantly recognize the need for impartiality and the need to make a serious change if that impartiality is ever broken, we can think of many such examples. Imagine the case in the NHL. If there were images displayed of an NHL referee wearing his referee's uniform, giving a pep talk to the Toronto Maple Leafs in their locker room during an intermission. how would fans of the Montreal Canadiens, the Ottawa Senators, the Edmonton Oilers, how would they feel if they ever had to see that referee ref a game between those two teams? Now, it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter if the referee did that because he happened to know one of the players, or maybe he had some close personal relationship and he didn't expect it to be videoed. He just thought that he'd go in and say a few encouraging words and then leave. Because once you see that image, you can't unsee it. And that doubt will always be there. And doubt is the opposite of trust, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Imagine a court proceeding. Imagine you're a defendant in a court case and you see an image, someone texts you an image of the judge in his robes at a backyard barbecue with the Crown prosecutor. Now, again, the judge might have all kinds of context that he would want you to understand before you jumped to conclusions. But would you want to go through a trial with a judge that had shown that kind of partiality and bias? I know I wouldn't. Imagine a situation between a union and management that has gone to arbitration, and then that arbitrator is seen at a restaurant in his attire in the same clothes he wears during the mediation session, and now he's sitting down with one of the parties involved in the dispute. Would a union want to accept a ruling, even if there was context, even if there was rationales behind it? Of course not. And that's the situation that we find ourselves here in this House, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And that is why our recommendation to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs will be to recommend to the House that the Speaker resign. Because we do not believe that to go forward, to accept those rulings without appeal, that this current Speaker can fulfill that rule. Yesterday I mentioned a few very important cases that are technically still under the purview of the Speaker, one touching on a budget bill, whether or not the budget bill was properly introduced because of a Ways and Means motion error that the government made. It's our contention that that motion should have been ruled out of order. That's a budget bill, Mr. Speaker. That's a Ways and Means motion. That's taxation and spending. And for us to trust that the Speaker made that ruling last week, free of any bias, free of any partiality, is just impossible after seeing those images. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I hope my colleagues in the House will agree with me that this situation is serious, that it matters not just to members, but to Canadians, because this is the pillar of our parliamentary democracy. Support this motion and support our calls at committee that the Speaker do the right thing, put the institution above himself as an individual, put the role primary, in a primary way, and do the right thing and step aside. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for bringing forward the motion, and of course, as a member of the New Democratic Party, I can echo much of the concern that he's expressed. We're very worried about this and the precedent that this is set, and we are very supportive of this going to procedures to the Proc Committee for further examination. And I wonder if the member could comment briefly on what specifically he would like to see the Proc Committee look into, what specific recommendations he'd like them to come up with.
Honourable member for Regina Capel.
I thank the honourable member for her question, and she touched upon a very important thing I'd just like to address. She talked about precedent. And one of the reasons why I brought this question through the form of a question of privilege is because I do fully believe that an important concept here was that future speakers see very clearly that this type of activity is so offensive to the House that they should take extra precautions to ever find themselves in a similar situation. The member asked what specific course of action we are recommending. I would just use this opportunity to again state that it is our belief that the Speaker has reached the point where to preserve that trust or reestablish that trust between the Office of Speaker and individual MPs, that he should step aside. I'll let Proc decide how best to deliberate. We do believe that there is a timeliness to this because every day that goes by there are questions before the chair that need to be decided. It may interest the committee to hear from the Speaker to get to the bottom of the invitations and any correspondence that went back and forth between the Liberal Party of Ontario and the Speaker's office to help substantiate what the Speaker claims to have happened. I'll leave that to procedure in House Affairs, but it is our belief that at this point, the best thing for the institution would be for the Speaker to step down.
Question commentaire, questions and comments. The honourable for Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I listened intently to this motion and the last one, and it appears we're going to be heading towards a meeting at Proc to discuss this. We've heard from the two parties that represent almost 150 members of Parliament, which is almost the majority that is calling for the resignation of the Speaker. The only party that is the only other opposition party that hasn't stated a position on the remedy is the NDP. I'd like to hear from a House Leader on the pressures or the consequences if the NDP does not side with the other 150 plus members that are calling for his resignation. What would be the consequences for those members?
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I think my colleague has made an important point. We are, just with the Bloc Québécois and the Conservatives, we are almost at a majority of the House. And I just have to say, for anybody in a leadership capacity to lead a group, especially a group like members of Parliament of the House of Commons who are divided by party, you cannot maintain that relationship with such a significant percentage of the group not having confidence in you. And I hope the Speaker reflects on that, because while I don't want to prejudge what may or may not happen, and I don't want to deal in hypotheticals, but I don't see how a Speaker could continue in the role knowing that virtually 50% of the people that he has to administer over or guide have lost confidence in him. So I hope he reflects on that in the coming hours and days.
We have a little quick question, time for a quick question. The Honourable Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a representative democracy, people who elect us to serve here have to have a certain degree of faith that our voices count and that their voices are heard through us. And I believe that that's why we have the standing order that requires the Speaker to be impartial. My colleague from the NDP raised a question about what recommendations she'd like Proc to make. I'm wondering in that vein if the Speaker could also talk about the need for, in order for the public to have faith in the function of Parliament, the impartiality of the Speaker's chair to be maintained.
The Honourable Member for Regina Capel in about 30 seconds.
Well, that's a very profound question that warrants more than just 30 seconds, but I understand the time constraints. So I'll just quickly say, especially when you have a government that was elected with such a low percentage of the votes. I mean, we have a government that has, for 2 elections in a row, received fewer votes than the main opposition party. So the vast majority of Canadians did not vote for this government, and they need to have trust that at the very least the government is constrained by some of the rules and traditions of this House. And the Speaker is the guardian of that. And so Canadians also have to have confidence in the impartiality of the Speaker.
Reprise du débat.
Resuming debate. The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I'd like to thank the member for Regina Capel, the opposition House Leader, for his speech. The member was Speaker of the House in the past, so when he raised the question of privilege, he knew exactly what was at stake and why it's important as Speaker of the House of Commons to be impartial, to be a referee and not one of the players on the ice here in the House of Commons. Mr. Speaker, I was shocked. I was shocked when I first saw the video of the current Speaker of the House that was played at the Liberal Convention, the Ontario Liberal Convention. I was shocked by what he said. I was shocked by the fact that not only after he was elected Speaker, but before, in the speech he made to get elected Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the member for Hull-Aylmer repeatedly mentioned the importance of words and acts and decorum in the House. As referee, as the person who's responsible for maintaining decorum in the House, as the person who has to do that, you have to display impeccable impartiality. And I would quote from that speech that the member for Hull-Aylmer made before he was elected Speaker. It's all a question of judgment, of course, but also of perception. And the member for Hull-Aylmer, before he was elected as Speaker, before all of us here in the House, he said this. He took his time. Each candidate gets a few minutes to make a little speech, and he took that opportunity to say this. The words we use matter. The symbols matter. I know full well, as your Speaker, I will act swiftly to restore honor to this chamber. I was shocked by that initially because I never felt that the honor of this place had been tarnished beforehand, but we, as a group, chose to elect the member for Hull-Aylmer as our Speaker. And in spite of that,
especially with that kind of speech, we would have thought that decorum would be untouchable here in this House. And the Speaker gave a statement before question period from his position at the front of the House. It was a surprising statement before question period to announce that he would seek to improve debate in the House of Commons. He intended to do better than previous speakers, Mr. Speaker. Who would have thought that just a couple of weeks later, not only all his attempts failed, but he showed partisanship at a degree that had not been seen since, well, I don't know since when. The words he proffered at the Liberal Convention in Ontario caused damage, great damage to his position as Speaker. Not only the words that were said, but the fact that they came after him saying that he wanted to bring better debate to this House. If a referee doesn't lead by example, how can one expect players to follow the rules? When the referee starts playing hockey, for example, if a referee were to start playing hockey and count goals as he wants to, and if a referee starts scoring goals, this takes credibility away from any decision the referee may take. That's how it is, to give a sporting analogy. Just to remind everyone, why did we receive this, raise this point of privilege? I would like to quote as an answer certain words from the video that led to today's situation. In the video that was seen by Liberal activists at the Liberal Convention to choose a new Ontario Liberal leader in Ontario, the Speaker was in his professional garb. The video was filmed in the Speaker's office, no doubt using House of Commons resources. And these words were very clear. And despite his apology that he delivered this week, he simply cannot erase what he said in this video. He said as follows, speaking about the interim Ontario Liberal leader, speaking about this Mr. Fraser, he said that he was very calm, he had conviction, and he was a very determined individual. He held the bar during a very difficult moment of our party's history. So it's clear, our party, it's a possessive. Even if in his apology, he said he wasn't a part of the Liberal Party, provincially in Ontario in any case. He didn't have a member's card, he didn't take part in activities. He still, in front of all these activists, took the time to say, our party. With regards to partisanship and perception, what is very clear is that the Speaker, dressed as Speaker of the House of Commons, in the office of the Speaker of the House of Commons, failed in his elementary duty of reserve. Other speakers have not gone to political conventions to do this kind of thing. This hasn't been the case in Canada. This hasn't been the case in other legislatures, in the Assemblée Nationale. It hasn't happened in the past in other countries that use the parliament, the British parliamentary system. There are a number of decisions made that clearly state that, pursuant to House of Commons Westminster statutes, clearly state that this cannot be done. It's a rule. It goes beyond tradition. It's a rule. A speaker should abstain from any display of partisanship. Madam Speaker, I would like to quote Parliamentary Procedure, 3rd edition, Province of Quebec, just to show that it's not only federally that we have to show this restraint as Speaker. So this is what the Quebec orders say. Speakership is ruled by the conventions that led to their appointment, but they must be neutral. Their neutrality goes through their behavior. Parliamentary procedures provide for a speaker to not be part of a party unless, and the speaker must not vote unless there is an even split. The speaker will follow the rules to show their true neutrality and their appearance of neutrality. Madam Speaker, and I'm being very sincere here, unfortunately, the Speaker, through this video that was shown at the Liberal Provincial Convention in Ontario, failed in this obligation to show true neutrality and to appear as neutral. And so, Madam Speaker, I would like to join in what my honourable colleague said. This case should be sent forthwith to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee. And the only outcome should be asking for the Speaker's resignation because he has lost the trust of the members of this House. Madam Speaker, while I'm here, I would like to table an amendment to the motion. The amendment is as follows, that the motion be amended by adding the following. The committee should A, meet within 24 hours after the reception of this order of reference to study the matter. B, make this question a priority, an absolute priority over others. C, an absolute priority when it comes to using House resources. And D, that this committee report to the House at the latest on Thursday, December 14th, 2023. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Mr. Berthold, seconded by Mr. Tucker, moves the following, that the motion be amended by adding the following. Provided that the committee shall A, meet within 24 hours of receiving this order of reference to consider the matter, B, make this matter a priority over all other business, C, have the first priority for the use of House resources for committee meetings, subject to the special orders adopted on Monday, May 16th, 2022 and Monday, December 4th, 2023. And D, be instructed to report back to the House no later than Thursday, December 14th, 2023. We will take this amendment under deliberation and then we'll go back to the House. Questions and comments?
The Honourable Member for Barry Ince.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I was also very shocked when I saw the Speaker addressing Liberal Party activists in Ontario. For most Canadians watching this debate, perhaps could my colleague talk about the trust of the House in the Speaker? Could he speak about what are the effects of the Speaker's decisions? There are more than 120 members that have asked the Speaker to step down. The NDP isn't speaking up now, but could my honourable colleague talk about this? The honourable member for Migrant-Éclairable. Madam Speaker, we are in a minority government situation. That means that there could be a vote, a very important vote, that would do as following. It could call Canadians to a general election at any time. At any time, this government could be toppled. And the importance of the Speaker, therefore, and of his or her decisions, of his or her neutrality, is essential. Because if we cannot trust our Speaker, the person who makes sure that rules are followed, we may be in an election if the government decides unilaterally to trigger an election just because they want an election. Unfortunately, when we don't trust in the Speaker, we will always doubt what he or she has to say. We will wonder from here on in whether the Speaker has followed rules or traditions or whether he or she has followed their own opinion. That is why Canadians have to follow this very closely, and that's why we've recommended that this be sent to proc. Questions and comments?
The Honourable Member for Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I've been honored to serve under 6 speakers. This is my 6th speaker. And I have to say this is the most partisan speaker that I've ever served under. And it is such a disdain to bring this up, but with such great hope that we had for this individual, the hope that returning respect and improvement of decorum, but from his actions on the weekend, the only obvious solution is for him to resign. I would like to know, do you believe that future speakers will view this as a precedent so that if we act in accordance to our traditions, it would be to further the position as being nonpartisan? But if we would decide to keep on the current speaker, it would lead to more partisanship creeping into that office. Would you agree or disagree with that stance?
I cannot pronounce myself, but I am going to ask the Honourable Member for Migrant-Éclairable.
Not in your name, Madam Speaker, but personally I would like to say that I agree with what my colleague has just said. Chaos. If we can't trust our Speaker, Madam Speaker, how can we trust and respect the decisions he makes in this case? His calls to order, how can we trust them? This is absolute chaos that we risk. I already have questions and doubts. There are 2 political parties that have asked for his resignation, another that have cast doubt upon the Speaker's sense of judgment for having participated in a partisan activity. 3 out of 4 recognised parties in the House of Commons have at least cast doubt on the speakership, on his sense of judgment, because of his participation in a partisan event. And so they cast doubt over his capacity to be non-partisan. And so from here, I don't see what other options we have. What options we have as colleagues. We must therefore ask the Speaker to step down. The amendment tabled is eligible, and so we shall now move on to debate on the amendment.
Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And one of the things I take a great deal of pride in is the fact that having had the opportunity to represent the people of Inkster for just under 20 years in the legislature in the province of Manitoba, and since 2010 being able to represent the people of Winnipeg North here in Ottawa, I have a passion for the debates that take place in the chamber, and I know at times even I can get somewhat political, Madam Speaker. And I know that's a little tough to believe. There are some things in which I would suggest to you should be treated in an apolitical fashion. I would suggest to you, Madam Speaker, that this is one of those situations where we should try to our greatest ability to ensure that we treat this matter in an apolitical fashion. And what I'd like to do is to read the motion that was actually introduced, the essence of the motion, Madam Speaker. The House refers the matter to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs with instruction that it recommend an appropriate remedy, Madam Speaker. When I read the motion, just like when I first heard the motion, I believe that the members of the Liberal caucus would say with me, as one, that it seemed to be a very fair motion. Let's have the issue, because we all recognize the serious nature of it, Madam Speaker. Let's have the Procedures and House Affairs Committee deal with the issue. And we're okay with that, Madam Speaker. We're okay with PROC dealing with the issue. But I would want to emphasize that in the motion, it makes it very clear that the House refers the matter to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs with instruction, and this is the most important part, Madam Speaker, of the motion, that it being the PROC Committee, recommend an appropriate remedy. Now, you know, I'm not a lawyer by profession. I can tell you that much. But I'm concerned in regards to some of the statements already by the mover and the seconder of the motion. I actually wrote down specifically what the most recent speaker said, and I quote, "The only outcome should be asking for the speaker's resignation because he has lost the trust of the members of this House." Madam Speaker, that seems to be an absolute opposite in terms of what the motion itself has said. It's as if members of the Conservative Party have already drawn a conclusion, and that concerns me. It should concern all members of the chamber, Madam Speaker. I have confidence and faith in the membership of the Standing Committee of Procedures and House Affairs. I would hope that any debate that happens to be taking place on this important issue this afternoon, and I would suggest to you, Madam Speaker, that what is best is that we reinforce 2 points. Number one, that this chamber and members should have confidence in the membership of the PROC committee. And number two, we let the PROC committee do what is actually being asked of them to do, Madam Speaker, and that is to recommend an appropriate remedy. The PROC committee, Madam Speaker, has the resources to be able to do what's necessary in order to come back to the floor of the House. The amendment, and this is a problem that I have with the amendment, in particular where it tries to put a deadline on the PROC committee, Madam Speaker. It is saying that it wants PROC to report back to the chamber by December the 14th, Madam Speaker. Again, I think that now through the form of an amendment to the motion, we are interfering with the PROC committee if in fact you believe, as I do, and as members I would suggest to you of the Liberal caucus, that we need to put politics, partisan politics to the side on this issue because we are talking about the Speaker of the House, Madam Speaker. That at the end of the day, I would suggest from a personal point of view that the amendment not be supported and we support the actual motion itself. So if you believe and have confidence in PROC, number one, and number two, want to depoliticize this issue, I would highly recommend that members seriously consider voting the way in which I have suggested from my perspective, Madam Speaker. With those few words, I'll leave it at that in hopes that PROC will be able to come up with a remedy as recommended by the motion itself.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Barrie Innisfil.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And the issue at hand is one of great urgency. It speaks to the confidence that the House has in the Speaker to perform his abilities in an independent and nonpartisan manner. I think the amendment is completely appropriate given the circumstances that we find ourselves in, and that is that the Procedure and House Affairs Committee deal with this matter expeditiously and then come back to the House with a recommendation. Does the honourable member not believe that the confidence of this House and its ability to hold the Speaker in a nonpartisan way, to have the ability to make the decisions that are required, and there are many decisions to come, does he not believe that this matter needs to be dealt with in the speed at which this amendment calls for?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, where the amendment references that PROC deal with the matter in an urgent fashion, I agree. But where the politics is entering in a very real way is when members that are speaking to the motion instruct that there has to be a resignation, and that's the outcome. I think that that's a huge jump, and it is a politically partisan jump. On the issue of the urgency, yes, in PROC, but when you say to PROC that you have to have a report in by December the 14th, remember, December the 14th could be our last day. We're here at latest till December the 15th, unless there's unanimous support for us to extend sitting in the month of December, Madam Speaker. So it seems to me, yes, the urgency. No, we don't have to have the report the day in which the House is going to be recessing or the day prior to the House releasing. If, in fact, we have the faith and confidence with the membership and we truly want to be apolitical in this, I'm taking people at their face value.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, what I find really interesting about this, and it speaks to the political partisanship of this particular issue, is that when the member from Regina Capel, the House Leader for the Conservatives, originally proposed his intervention this morning, he made no reference to calling on the Speaker to resign. Then the next intervention, the Bloc Québécois called on the Speaker to resign, and then, as though not to be outdone, the member from Regina Capel then ran back into the House, rose on another point of order, and said that the Speaker should resign. And now he's come to the conclusion, a mere couple hours later, that there's absolutely no other option than for the Speaker to resign. Yet, in his entirety of his intervention, when he started off on this morning, never once raised it. I'm wondering if the member can...
Oui, sur un rappel au règlement, l'honorable député Mégantic-Lérable.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-Lérable. Yes, Madam Speaker, it's very important to have the facts when we speak about partisanship and the Speaker of the House. This didn't all happen within the same day. This happened yesterday.
Lérable is referring to the fact that this started yesterday, not this morning. But it's putting perspective in the observations the member was making about a couple of hours, so it does make a point. Merci.
I still don't see the procedural error that I made there. I certainly made an error with respect to the timing. It wasn't a procedural error for the member to stand up on a point of order. In any event, Madam Speaker, my point was just to say that when the leader for the Conservatives, the House Leader, rose on this original point of order, he never once made reference to the Speaker resigning. He didn't actually do that until he decided he needed to because the Bloc Québécois was doing that. So to me, that just signals that there's a great degree of partisanship going on here. And then to the Parliamentary Secretary's point, when he actually made his comments and he was directing this issue to the House Procedure and House Affairs Committee, already precluded what the outcome would be. I'm wondering if the Parliamentary Secretary would like to provide his insight into that.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, I would really like to emphasize a couple of points. First and foremost, at the end of the day, given the importance and the respect I would like to think that every member of the House has for our democracy and our standing orders and so forth, and the amount of respect that we should have towards the chair, I would like to think that we can put the partisan politics to the side. That is number one. And if in fact they're prepared to do that, Madam Speaker, I think then we can make some significant progress in enabling and supporting the PROC committee in coming up with what would hopefully be a unanimous report in terms of what should come of the Speaker's actions, Madam Speaker. My concern is that there are already hints that some say that they want to treat it in an apolitical fashion, but their actions seem to speak differently.
Questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Saskatoon University.
Yes, when he refers to our House Leader coming or other members, individual members, it's 150 members of this place that raised the concern with this individual. It's not just one individual, one Conservative, or one Bloc. It's the actual individuals, and it represents every region in Canada. And Canadians are watching. They're very disturbed what's been going on in this place. And now to find out that the head referee is in the tank for one of the sides, it appears, I would say that is very disdainful for Canadians that have fought for this country, fought for our democracies and freedoms, and for us to throw it away in an instance where partisanship now is commonplace in the Speaker's office is shameful.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Here's what the member said across the way. The only outcome should be asking for the Speaker's resignation because he has lost the trust of the members of this House. That is drawing a conclusion before even PROC is assigned the responsibility of dealing with the issue. And that's what I mean. If the Conservative Party's approach is we want to hang them and hang them high, no matter what, Madam Speaker, we want a resignation, and that's the position that they take.
I ask the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to be prudent with the choice of words, considering the situation we are addressing. Please. Moderation.
Madam Speaker, I would, without any hesitation, retract the comment. And I would apologize. The point is, Madam Speaker, is that at the end of the day, if you really and truly want to be apolitical on it, then the words that you speak inside the House and what takes place in PROC should clearly demonstrate that. That's what I'm asking for. And at the end of the day, it needs to be consistent. And I hope that's what we will see.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Chatham-Kent-Leamington.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I know that it's not proper parliamentary procedure to bring to the attention the presence or absence of a member of the chamber. What I don't know is whether I can do that to myself. So I will admit that I wasn't in the chamber when the amendment was brought forward. So my question to the member across the way is, this amendment is dealing with the deferring to the PROC committee and a time of returning a decision by December 14th. The amendment does not talk about a resignation, does it?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, you're right. The member is right. The essence of the motion is this, and let's be very, very clear on it. The House refers the matter to the Standing Committee on Procedures and House Affairs with an instruction that it being PROC, recommend an appropriate remedy. And the argument that I was putting forward is that if you really and truly believe that this should be apolitical, that we should treat the Speaker's chair with the utmost respect, put partisan politics to the side, then as a collective caucus, you should not be calling for the resignation of the Speaker of the House of Commons. Right. It's an absolute opposite. You cannot have it both ways.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Government Deputy House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. What I'm hearing the Parliamentary Secretary say is that he supports what is being proposed. He supports the PROC setting this issue and making a recommendation back, but he just believes that rather than trying to get an answer, or rather trying to dictate the answer from this House, like the member from Regina Capel did in his intervention, he's saying that let the committee do their work and provide the recommendation back. This is why I'm led to believe that this is nothing more than a hyper-partisan game, another one put on by the Conservatives, because of the manner in which they're treating this issue that they claim to take so seriously, but then on the other hand, treat it with such disregard as to say, well, there's only one possible outcome.
Parliamentary Secretary, 30 seconds.
Speaker, that's why I started off by my comments by talking about my history and respect that I have for the institution. And at the end of the day, given the importance of the Speaker's chair and the role that it plays, I would like to think that going to PROC, the Liberal caucus supports that. But it's critically important that everyone recognize that the partisanship needs to be put to the side. The most appropriate action would be for opposition members, if they're going to continue to talk about it, is to concur with that thought, that we need to put the parties. Let's not draw conclusions.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This debate is of great importance. The partisan jabs that I'm seeing from both the Conservatives and the Liberals, I find them very inappropriate. This is an important debate, and it's one that affects the very foundations of our Parliament. So I think that these jabs are not appropriate at all. Madam Speaker, I rose not long ago, in October. I rose about the crisis at that time regarding the former Speaker. At that time, Madam Speaker, that every day members trust in the Speaker to guide Parliament through difficult circumstances. At that time, Madam Speaker, I said that the current Speaker at the time had acquitted himself of his duties extremely well, whether it be with early COVID, the occupation of downtown Ottawa, or the hybrid parliament system. But nonetheless, according to the practices of the House of Commons, the Speaker holds not only a procedural but also a ceremonial and diplomatic position. And the Speaker must often be the representative of the Commons. At that time, I said that for the NDP caucus, rather, and if you look at the precedents and practices and values of this House, I said at that time that with great regret, I was going to have to ask for the resignation of the former Speaker. Madam Speaker, you will recall that at that time, we were the only party to rise in the House to say that we would be asking for the Speaker's resignation. Given our values and due to the procedure of the House, and with great regret, this is not something that should stem from partisanship. It's not something that should be done overly quickly. All Canadians care deeply about this, and we really need to look at the next steps.
That precedent that was set in October, the NDP approaches this issue with that same thoroughness of thought, looking at the procedures, looking at the principles of this Parliament, and the best way to advance the Parliament and ensure that this Parliament is something of which all Canadians can be proud. And when I rose yesterday, Madam Speaker, I did say very clearly that we were dismayed seeing the Speaker in that video tribute to the outgoing interim provincial Liberal leader. Even more so, Madam Speaker, because the video was shot from the Speaker's chamber and in the traditional Speaker's robes. J'avais dit aussi que, tel que mentionné dans
I had also said that, as mentioned in the House of Commons procedure and practice, it is very clear that in order to guarantee the impartiality of his position, the Speaker must abstain from all partisan political activity. I also said at that time, Madam Speaker, that the apology made by the Speaker partially explained why this regrettable situation occurred. We understand that the video was for distribution at a small party for a personal friend. It is still the Speaker's duty to ensure that the message not be used in a partisan context. We, of course, agree about the fact that the Speaker has recused himself in this important matter.
I rose to say, on behalf of the NDP caucus, that we believe the proper way to deal with this is to refer the matter to committee, to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs, for them to study and recommend any appropriate remedies to ensure that this never happens again, Madam Speaker. And that's, I think, something that all members of Parliament should share, that we need to ensure this never happens again, particularly because of what was a parliamentary crisis. I think it's fair to say in the month of October that we need to have that assurance at all times that there is strict impartiality coming from the Speaker's chair. Now, we understand the Speaker's explanation and his apology, but we do believe that it needs to be referred to Procedure and House Affairs, that this question needs to be fully studied and brought back in a timely way so that members of Parliament can deliberate on the decisions made by Procedure and House Affairs. That is the committee that is charged with this type of situation. And, Madam Speaker, the Speaker's ruling earlier today is, I think, sets that very clear direction that it needs to go to Procedure and House Affairs for that timely study and those remedies to be brought back to the House. And so this is the approach that we certainly believe is important. It is something that we have been wavering on, Madam Speaker, and I do need to raise, I think, a point of consideration. I note that yesterday the member from Regina Capel, who I have a lot of respect for, provided a very extensive reasoning for his question of privilege that included referring this to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. I thought that the research that was done was thorough, it was effective, and I agreed with his question of privilege. And that's why I noted it when I spoke after question period, not having been able to speak before question period because I'm sitting on the Public Safety Committee, Madam Speaker. As you know, New Democrats in this House all do double, triple functions. So none of us have a single job. We all have 2, 3, 4 jobs. And so I couldn't be at 2 places at once, which is why I spoke after question period. Now, Madam Speaker, I should mention as well that the NDP, because of our 25 members, receives smaller resources through the House Leader's Office than any other party. And I wanted to say very clearly, in the very small team that we have, Blake Evans and Alexandrine Latendresse do a fabulous job in the House Leader's Office. Yes, absolutely. We have 2 members, and yet we prepared and provided in the House after question period that very lengthy and I thought well thought out argument that was based on what was said by the official opposition that has far more resources. We have a 2-member team. They have an official opposition office that is much, much, much larger. We came to the same conclusion, Madam Speaker, and I think that shows that even with smaller resources, you can have an equally effective team. I was surprised, Madam Speaker, after citing the member from Regina Capel, that he seemed to put aside the very learned and deep analysis that he'd given, referring this to Procedure and House Affairs, and took quite a different stand. And I'm a little perplexed, Madam Speaker, that he would do that after providing in the morning something that I think all members of Parliament would agree to, that this should go to Procedure and House Affairs. So I note that. I thank our team, the mighty twosome in the House Leader's Office, for their terrific work. But the reality is we are unwavering. We're not changing our position through the course of the day. We're not saying something different today than we did yesterday. We believe this needs to go to Procedure and House Affairs. We believe that the remedies need to be provided by that committee and brought back to the House. So we have not changed on this. We believe this is a serious issue. We need to ensure that this never happens again. And that's why, unwaveringly, the NDP is supportive of the motion. In fact, Madam Speaker, if it had not been proposed by the member from Regina Capel, we would have been providing that motion in another, taking another route, Madam Speaker. So it appears that the government, initially not seeing this as a serious issue, now has agreed that it is serious. I understand that we have some consensus that this be referred to Procedure and House Affairs, and I welcome that, because on an issue like this, I think it's important that we have that all-party agreement to refer it to Procedure and House Affairs, which is the venue that this should be directed to, and to allow them to do that timely work, and then to have the House consider the results of that work. So, Madam Speaker, I'm hoping that the debate will continue on at Procedure and House Affairs. If we do have that agreement, that is where this should go. And on behalf of the NDP caucus, we would say this is a serious matter that needs to be dealt with in a serious way, in a thoughtful manner, and that's why we're supporting the motion. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member from Barrie Innisfil.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for speaking on this matter, and I can tell by the somberness of his tone that he is taking this issue as seriously as it needs to be taken. My question to him is, when this, or if this does go to PROC, the matter needs to be dealt with in an expedited manner. It needs to be dealt with within the next week, in my opinion, and the opinion of many members of this House, in order to come to some sort of outcome, for PROC to make a recommendation to the House of some sort of outcome on what the Speaker has done. And it speaks directly to the confidence of not just this institution, but the confidence of all members in the Speaker's ability to make decisions free of any partisanship. So my question to the Honourable Member is, can we expect this to be done quickly at PROC in order to ensure that the confidence of the House is maintained, and certainly the confidence in the Speaker's ability to make nonpartisan decisions? Thank you.
The Honourable Member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. He's former official opposition House Leader, and so he understands the rules and understands the importance and the gravity of this situation. The reality is, Madam Speaker, and I think the member was asking a rhetorical question because he understands, as I do, that this would have to take precedence for procedure in House Affairs. If this is a House order at which the adoption of this motion would be, it then becomes the top priority for procedure in House Affairs. So I have confidence that procedure in House Affairs will treat it with the timeliness that is required and ensure that this is the top priority of that committee moving forward. And the rules of the House, Madam Speaker, as you well know, indicate that as well, that the committee can't simply continue doing other work. This is an order of the House, and so procedure in House Affairs will have to put it top of mind.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I appreciate the comments from the New Democratic House Leader. I know he has been, in many ways, a parliamentarian first and foremost in many different respects. And when we take a look at the matter at hand, and the idea that we need to ensure as much as possible that we take the political partisanship out of the debate. And I think that is achievable. And enable procedures in House Affairs Committee to ultimately make that determination. But it's so important, given the very nature of the institution, and if we are, as parliamentarians, making that as our first priority, that we will get the most positive result for the institution if, in fact, we take politics out of the or the partisanship out of the process. And I'm wondering if he could just provide his thoughts in regards to the institution and how important it is that we do make it apolitical.
The Honourable Member for Westminster Burnaby.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I know I can be partisan often. I know the member can be partisan often. I think we both, with his long experience, and I've been in this rodeo a few times as well, that there are times when it is appropriate to be partisan. There are times when it is clearly not. This is one of those times when it is clearly not appropriate to be partisan in any way. We're dealing with an institution that has led our Parliament for more than a century and a half. It is vitally important that we preserve the institution, that we ensure that best practices are part of the institution, and the procedure in House Affairs will be, if we adopt this motion, which seems almost certain, then the procedure in House Affairs Committee will be charged with finding those remedies to ensure that this type of situation does not occur again moving forward. And so I think all members of Parliament will approach this in a thoughtful way, in a nonpartisan way, and in a way that gives credit and merit to our Parliament. We are the reflection of Canadians and Canadian democracy, and we need to act in that way. There are times when it is appropriate to be partisan. This is not one of those times. We must all ensure that we are doing something that is to the benefit of Canadian democracy and to Canada's Parliament.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to start by thanking the member for New Westminster Burnaby and the House Leader for the NDP for the measured tone he's taken to this conversation, both in his comments this afternoon and of yesterday, and the substance as well. I think it has heightened our democracy, the approach he's taken. I'd like to follow up on these comments we've heard with respect to how the Procedure in House Affairs Committee would deal with this. Of course, we've seen in the last year that committee has been a particularly partisan one, where we've seen some measure of theatrics at times. And so I'd like to understand from him if he could give advice to the MPs on that committee and or to the House on how we might see PROC move ahead with this in a way that reflects the answer he just gave to the member for Winnipeg North. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for his question as well. He's a relatively new member of Parliament, but he certainly understands the importance of us removing our partisan hats at key moments in our nation's history. This is one of those times when we have gone through the convulsions of what was an unprecedented situation in October, where I felt very strongly it was appropriate, and the NDP caucus felt it was appropriate to ask for that Speaker's resignation. I have not done that in this time, because I feel the circumstances are different, but also I think we have to take a measured, thoughtful approach on this issue. That's why Procedure in House Affairs, I believe, I certainly hope, and I know the member does as well, that Procedure in House Affairs will step up, understand the importance of the situation, understand the importance in a nonpartisan way of offering those remedies that can be brought back to the House in a timely way. These are things that are of vital importance, and I know there have been times in this nation's history when all members of Parliament have stood together. One has to just think of the COVID-19 pandemic, where, as you'll recall, Madam Speaker, decisions had to be made by unanimous consent. And we did it together. We took those measures together to provide supports for Canadians right across the country. And that is something to every members of Parliament credit, that we all stood together to ensure that Canadians had the wherewithal to weather the pandemic. This is another example of that kind of situation where MPs have to stand together, and members of PROC, I think, will understand that and work together to provide those remedies.
Questions and comments? Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. When I'm thinking of the Procedures and House Affairs Committee and the opportunity that will be there for the committee, I think in many ways the potential of witnesses. Canada is a part of the Commonwealth. In the Commonwealth, I think that there's experiences that we can be drawn upon that would help the Procedures and House Affairs Committee in being able to come up with a remedy to the situation. So I just want to get my colleagues' thoughts in regards to the importance of PROC being able to entertain, at the very least, the possibility of having some important witnesses that would actually be able to contribute, using even potentially some of our Commonwealth friends that are out there that have some real tangible experiences on the issue, and to reflect in terms of even what's taken place in Canada in the last 40, 50 years, that PROC does have the opportunity and will have the time to be able to look over and ultimately come up with a better remedy because of the research capabilities of a standing committee.
The Honourable Member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I did hear you say resuming debate, so okay, no, that's quite all right. That's quite all right. And I always appreciate the questions from my colleague from Winnipeg North. The reality is the Procedure in House Affairs will make those decisions. I do feel it's important that there be a timely resolution on this for obvious reasons. This is a priority. It has to be a priority, given that it's a House order for Procedure in House Affairs. At the same time, it's important that those remedies be provided in a timely way. So I will allow, and I think all of us will allow the Procedure in House Affairs committee members to decide how to balance out the timeliness with getting as well witnesses that help to provide those supports for developing the remedies. That's a balance that they will have to achieve, and I wish them the best of luck in doing that.
Order. It is my duty, pursuant to Standing Order 38, to inform the House that the questions to be raised tonight at the time of adjournment are as follows. The Honourable Member for Lanark, Frontenac Kingston on Correctional Services of Canada. The Honourable Member for Spadina Fort York, Health. The Honourable Member for Cypress Hills Grasslands, Carbon Pricing. Resuming debate, the Honourable Member.
I'm just letting everybody know that I'm shutting the channel down in 10 minutes in order to get ready for question period. I'll be going live at 2 p.m. Eastern Canada time.
And the motion specifically calls, I'll read the motion out, that the Speaker's public participation at an Ontario Liberal Party convention as Speaker of the House of Commons constitutes a breach of the tradition and expectations of impartiality required for that high office, constituting a serious error of judgment which undermines the trust required to discharge his duties and responsibilities, and therefore the House refers the matter to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs with instruction that it recommend an appropriate remedy. And I think that this is a good course of action, Madam Speaker, a course of action that came out as a result of your ruling earlier today, that this is typically the proper course of action in order to deal with this. And I echo some of the comments that I've heard through the House in this debate, specifically as it relates to trying to reduce the partisan nature around this particular issue. You know, as others have indicated, the Speaker's chair is extremely important in our democratic institution, in the Westminster parliamentary system specifically, which we utilize here. It is a role that, despite the fact that a Speaker is elected by his or her peers in this place, the Speaker might come from a particular political party, and obviously does. Well, not always, but we usually run under a political banner. And then once we get to this place and actually elect the Speaker to sit in that chair, they do need to ensure that they are completely impartial in terms of how they're running the House. And of course, that should extend to what they do outside of the House as well, because having the perception of impartiality is just as important as having actual partiality as it relates to the role of the Speaker. I come from a riding that has a tradition of having, a former Speaker Milliken was the longest serving Speaker in this House. And I must admit, when I first heard of heard what had occurred, he was the first one that I thought to contact to get his opinion on this. I haven't had an opportunity to do that yet, but I think that lending or calling on former speakers and former people that have worked in the clerk's office to seek guidance on this is extremely important. And that's why I think that it's important that we do get this motion or this issue before the Procedure and House Affairs Committee so that we can do that study. I know that there have already been calls in this House, predetermined outcome as to how people see the result coming back from committee. I tend to err on the side of allowing the committee to do their work, to properly investigate this, and to call people like former Speaker Milliken and other people who perhaps worked in the Speaker's office to provide important insight into the role of the Speaker and how they should be perceived inside the House, outside of the House, and how the importance of that role. So being a member of the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, under the assumption that this motion will pass and be sent to committee, I look forward to the opportunity to do that, to properly do that that research and to look into it, and to do it as the member from Burnaby said moments ago, as quickly as possible, given that the serious nature of this and the fact that it is something that we are tasked with dealing with immediately. What that outcome will be and how the committee ends up reporting back, I think will be based on the deliberations that occur in the committee, based on the content of the information that's received, how we assess the content based on other examples of what has occurred, and then the committee can make a recommendation back to the House in terms of what it sees the appropriate course of action being. For members to get up in the House, including the one that just heckled me moments ago, and to say that there's no other option and that 150 so members feel a certain way right now, well then my question to that member would be, what's the point in even sending this to the committee?
The honourable member for York Simcoe on a point of order.
Point of order is no one was heckling this member. He constantly does this for attention, Madam Speaker.
Well, I heard it, and I didn't interrupt it. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Corey.
Please, we do not name colleagues in the chamber. Please do not refer to members by name. If the honourable member could retract, please. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And thank you for validating my claim there, because it did occur. And the reality is that if
the honourable member to retract the mentioning of the name, please, of the person.
well, another member said who. I said the person's name. I shouldn't have done that. I apologize, Madam Speaker. But just back to the substance, and what I was trying to say is that the member is still heckling me. The exact same member is still heckling me.
The honourable member apologized, which, okay, in my view, it means that he retracts what he said because he apologizes for saying it. But the honourable member for Kingston and the Isles.
Like I said, when that member or other members stand up during questions during this debate and make claims that 150 members of his caucus already feel a certain way, then it makes me just wonder what's the purpose in even sending this to committee if the outcome has already been predetermined, at least by one particular group. But it doesn't diminish the fact that the committee can still do very good work in this matter, Madam Speaker. And I think that the committee can actually use this as an opportunity, Madam Speaker, not just to figure out the proper recourse in terms of what should be done now in terms of what has occurred and what the proper remedy is to it, but to set a precedent in terms of and to set certain rules and to establish a best practice to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again. I don't know the context behind why the Speaker chose to do this, and nor will I try to guess as to what that was. But what I will say is that the Speaker has stood and apologized and recognized that it wasn't the best course of action, but he nonetheless has done that. And that's why I think that it's extremely important that we accept that, but that we still determine if there's the next other courses of action that need to be taken. We also have an amendment, Madam Speaker, on the motion that came forward after. And it was odd because the motion was moved, and then a second, the second speaker from the same party put forward an amendment. I don't know why they didn't just include it in the full motion. And that was that the motion be amended by adding the following, quote, provided the committee shall A, meet within 24 hours of receiving the order of reference to consider the matter, B, make this matter a priority over other business, C, have the first priority of the use of the House resources for committee meetings, subject to the orders adopted on Monday, May 16th, 2022, and Monday, December 4th, 2023, and D, be instructed to report back to the House no later than Thursday, December the 14th. The original motion set the context of what the work that needed to be done was and how important it was, and then it appears as though the amendment that came forward just moments later seemed to get very prescriptive in terms of how to deal with the issue. I would have thought that this would have just all come together. It's certainly not a motion that was, not an amendment that was, well, it certainly does not appear to be an amendment that came out as a result of listening to the debate and then proposing it. It was obviously something that was, at least I perceive it to be something that was well planned in advance in how this was tabled. My sense it's probably to try to pressure political parties one way or the other from
All right, everybody, that's it. Have a good one. We'll see you at 2 o'clock for the live stream of House of Commons.